You think Snow White is just a fairy tale about a princess and a poison apple? Psychologists analyzing classic fairy tales have discovered something profound about why these stories endure across centuries. They're not just entertainment, but psychological maps of internal struggles that every person faces. When developmental psychologists examined Snow White's narrative structure, they found it wasn't a distorted legend, but an extraordinarily accurate representation of specific self-sabotage patterns, particularly how people unconsciously accept poison disguised as something desirable. The most revealing part? The story captures psychological dynamics that contemporary research validates. How we're drawn to what harms us, how we ignore warning signs, how we repeatedly fall for the same destructive patterns despite having survived them before. This isn't about hidden meanings or conspiracy. This is about how fairy tales preserve psychological truths across generations. And what Snow White specifically reveals about the pattern where you know something is dangerous but accept it anyway. And understanding these patterns in the story helps recognize them in your own life, where you're unconsciously sabotaging yourself through the same mechanism Snow White demonstrates. Not every interpretation of fairy tales is psychologically valid. There's a critical difference between legitimate psychological analysis based on archetypal patterns and developmental research versus wild speculation projecting modern concerns onto old stories. Psychologists like Bruno Bettelheim, Marie-Louise von Franz, and Clarissa Pinkola Estes studied fairy tales systematically, documenting how these narratives encode genuine psychological truths about human development, internal conflicts, and recurring patterns. But they were careful to distinguish between universal psychological themes that appear consistently across cultures and personal projections that reveal more about the interpreter than the story. Snow White has been analyzed extensively by depth psychologists who found that its structure, the jealous stepmother, the huntsman who can't kill her, the dwarfs who protect but can't save her, the three attempts with increasingly effective disguises, the poison apple, maps precisely onto documented patterns of how people sabotage themselves through accepting harm disguised as care or pleasure. What appears as a simple fairy tale from surface contains sophisticated psychology about internal dynamics. Real psychological analysis distinguishes between what the story structure actually reveals versus what interpreters want to project onto it. In this video, I'm going to reveal what psychological analysis of Snow White shows about self-sabotage patterns, why the story structure captures something that developmental and clinical psychology confirms about human behavior, and what the specific elements, the mirror, the huntsman, the disguises, the apple, represent about internal psychological dynamics. You'll discover what psychologists recognize in Snow White's repeated vulnerability despite warnings, and why this pattern is so common in human behavior. These are insights from depth psychology, developmental psychology, and fairy tale analysis about what this particular story reveals regarding how and why people harm themselves. By the end, you'll understand what Snow White's pattern shows about your own potential self-sabotage mechanisms. This isn't a video claiming conspiracy about distorted legends or hidden meanings suppressed by authorities. This is examining what psychologists have documented about fairy tales as psychological narratives, and what Snow White specifically reveals about self-destructive patterns. This video is for people interested in understanding their own self-sabotage through psychological frameworks that fairy tales preserve. If you've noticed you repeat similar mistakes despite knowing better, if you accept harm disguised as care, if you ignore warnings about people or situations that ultimately hurt you, you're about to understand a psychological pattern Snow White demonstrates. If you're ready to understand what fairy tale analysis reveals about self-sabotage, keep watching. Think about the structure of Snow White's story. The evil queen, her stepmother, tries to kill her 3 times. First with a lace bodice that constricts her breathing. Second with a poison comb. Third with a poisoned apple. Each time, the dwarfs warn Snow White not to let anyone in. Each time, Snow White survives the first 2 attempts and knows someone is trying to harm her. And yet each time, when the queen comes in increasingly obvious disguises, Snow White opens the door and accepts what's offered. Why? Psychologists analyzing this pattern recognize it as extraordinarily accurate representation of how self-sabotage actually works. You know something is dangerous. You've been warned. You've survived previous harm from the same source. And yet, when the danger appears in slightly different form, disguised as something desirable, You accept it again. This isn't stupidity in the story. It's precise psychological truth about how the psyche works. The psychological weight of this pattern is that Snow White represents the part of consciousness that, despite experience and warning, remains vulnerable to harm disguised as care, pleasure, or beauty. She's not failing to learn. She's demonstrating how certain psychological patterns override learning because they operate at a deeper level than rational knowledge. Psychological analysis of fairy tales has rich tradition, and Snow White has been examined extensively. The psychoanalyst Bruno Bettelheim, in The Uses of Enchantment, analyzed how fairy tales help children process psychological development challenges. He found that Snow White specifically deals with narcissism, the evil queen's mirror obsession, Oedipal dynamics, stepmother-daughter competition, and the development from latency into sexual maturity. The repeated attacks represent psychological threats during development rather than external dangers. The Jungian analyst Marie-Louise von Franz analyzed fairy tales as representations of archetypal patterns in the psyche. She interprets Snow White as showing the conflict between ego consciousness, Snow White, and the devouring mother archetype, evil queen. The three attempts represent progressively deeper attacks on consciousness, first constricting a bodice, then poisoning thoughts, comb, finally poisoning core vitality, apple. The story shows how the psyche sabotages itself through internalized critical/destructive voices. The psychologist Clarissa Pinkola states in Women Who Run with the Wolves analyzed Snow White as representing the pattern where women accept poison from female authority figures, internalized criticism, impossible beauty standards, self-destructive behaviors, because these come disguised as care, concern, or help. The evil queen doesn't appear as evil. She appears as peddler offering beautiful things. This is how self-sabotage works. It arrives disguised as self-improvement, care, or pleasure. The developmental psychologist Sheldon Cashdan examined fairy tales through attachment and developmental lens, finding that Snow White represents a common pattern where children and later adults remain vulnerable to harmful caregivers because they need care, even if that care is poisoned. The dwarfs represent healthy relationships that protect but can't fully save Snow White from her vulnerability to the queen, meaning external support helps but doesn't eliminate internal vulnerability to self-sabotage. But here's what the specific elements of Snow White reveal about self-sabotage patterns when examined psychologically. The mirror represents the critical self-evaluating voice that always finds you inadequate. The evil queen's question, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's fairest of all?" represents the insatiable need for validation that no amount of beauty, success, or achievement satisfies. When you operate from this consciousness, you're perpetually threatened by anyone who might be better, and you attack yourself. Snow White is you, younger/more vital, to maintain the illusion of superiority. The psychological pattern, self-criticism that masquerades as self-improvement, but actually harms your vitality and authentic development. The huntsman who's ordered to kill Snow White, but can't do it, represents the part of consciousness that knows self-destruction is wrong even when ordered by authority, internal or external. He lets her go, but takes evidence back to satisfy the queen. This represents how we sometimes perform self-care for appearances while not fully protecting ourselves from harm. The pattern, going through motions of self-protection without genuine commitment. The dwarfs who take Snow White and represent healthy supporting relationships or aspect of self that provides shelter and care. But they're limited, they're small, they work underground, unconscious. They warn her but can't force her to protect herself. This represents how external support or healthy impulses can help but ultimately can't prevent self-sabotage if you're determined unconsciously to accept poison. The pattern, having support but not using it effectively when crucial moment comes. The three disguises a queen uses: old peddler woman offering beautiful bodice, different peddler offering beautiful comb, finally peasant woman offering beautiful apple, represent how self-sabotage arrives in increasingly subtle disguises. First attack is most obvious, constriction, but Snow White is naive. Second attack, she's been warned but still accepts. Third attack, she knows danger but the apple is so beautiful she can't resist. This represents psychological truth. Self-sabotage doesn't arrive announcing itself as harmful. It arrives as something attractive, an opportunity, a relationship, a substance, a behavior that appeals to genuine desire for beauty, pleasure, relief, while containing poison. The The pattern. You know better. You've been hurt before. But when harm appears disguised as something you want, you accept it anyway. The poison apple specifically, red on one side, white on the other. The queen eating the white side to prove it's safe, represents the most sophisticated self-sabotage. You convince yourself it's fine by finding apparent evidence. The queen eats part safely. You focus on how beautiful/desirable it is, reddest apple you've ever seen, and you dismiss the warnings because this time it seems different. The pattern. Rationalization that overrides genuine danger signals because you want what's being offered. The deep sleep that follows eating the apple represents what happens after successful self-sabotage. A kind of death that isn't quite death. You're still alive but not truly living. Consciousness is suspended. This represents how self-sabotage often leads to numbness, depression, or going through life mechanically. Still functioning but not truly alive. The pattern. The aftermath of self-sabotage is often the suspended state where you're not engaging with life fully. The prince who awakens Snow White with a kiss represents different things in different psychological interpretations. For some, it's external savior, problematic reading that suggests women need rescuing. For others, it's emergence of mature consciousness or sexuality that awakens from latency. For developmental reading, it represents that sometimes growth occurs through connection rather than through individual will. Relationships can catalyze awakening from self-sabotage patterns. But crucially, in most versions, the awakening comes when Snow White is moved. The jarring of being carried dislodges the apple piece from her throat. This suggests that awakening from self-sabotage requires disruption, movement, change in position. You can't awaken while remaining in the same position that the poison put you in. The pattern. Recovery from self-sabotage requires active disruption of the pattern, not passive waiting. Now, here's the crucial psychological insight. Snow White's vulnerability isn't stupidity or weakness. It's accurate representation of how self-sabotage actually works in human psychology. Research on addiction, abusive relationships, self-destructive behaviors consistently shows that people repeat harmful patterns despite knowing better, despite previous pain, despite warnings. The knowing happens at cognitive level, but the vulnerability operates at deeper emotional or psychological level, where the disguise works, with a promise of pleasure, beauty, relief, or fulfillment overrides rational knowledge of danger. Snow White demonstrates that you can know something is dangerous and still be vulnerable to it when it arrives disguised as something desirable. The transformation that occurs when you recognize Snow White's pattern in your own life is seeing your self-sabotage clearly for first time. Remember patterns you've repeated. Accepting harm disguised as care, ignoring warnings about people or situations, convincing yourself this time is different despite evidence. When you recognize these as Snow White pattern, your vulnerability makes psychological sense rather than being personal failure. Your self-sabotage isn't stupidity. It's this documented pattern where harm disguised as something desirable bypasses rational knowledge. You're not uniquely flawed. You're demonstrating universal human vulnerability that fairy tale captured centuries ago. Understanding this creates several shifts. You can identify the evil queen in your life, which might be internalized critical voice, might be actual person who harms while claiming to help, might be addictive substance or behavior that promises pleasure while delivering poison. You recognize the pattern of increasingly sophisticated disguises, how self-sabotage adapts its presentation when you survive first attempts. You understand your own dwarfs, the healthy relationships or impulses at war and protect, but can't force you to save yourself. You see the poison apples, the specific forms your self-sabotage takes, what makes them attractive enough that you override warnings. You recognize when you're in deep sleep. Going through life mechanically after successful self-sabotage has numb consciousness. Now here's where fairy tale analysis becomes practically useful rather than just interesting interpretation. Understanding Snow White's pattern helps you interrupt your own self-sabotage through specific recognition points. First, recognition. Notice when something appears that's beautiful, desirable, or promises pleasure/relief while coming from questionable source or in questionable context. This is Snow White accepting things from disguised evil queen. The red flag isn't what's offered, but who's offering or in what context. Ask, why is this appearing now? What makes me want to accept it despite warning signs? Second, recognition. Notice when you're rationalizing against your own warnings or others' concerns. Snow White knew danger, but convinced herself the apple was safe. When you find yourself explaining away danger signals or dismissing concerns, you're potentially in Snow White pattern. Ask, am I making excuses to accept something I know might harm me? Third, recognition. Notice patterns of repeated harm from similar sources. If you've been hurt before by same person, substance, behavior, type, or situation, and it appears again in slightly different form, you're at Snow White's third door opening. Ask, have I been here before? Am I falling for same poison in different disguise? Fourth, recognition. Notice the deep sleep state, when you're functioning but not really living, when you're numb or going through motions. This is post-sabotage state, requiring disruption to awaken from. Ask, am I truly alive or am I in suspended state, waiting for something to change? The intervention Snow White story suggests you need your own dwarfs, healthy relationships, practices, or commitments that warn and protect when you're vulnerable. You need to recognize your specific disguises. How does self-sabotage appear in your life? What makes it attractive enough to override warnings? You need the prince metaphorically. Whatever disrupts your pattern, whether that's therapy, crisis, relationship, or conscious choice to change position you're in, you need to deal with the evil queen, the source of poison, whether internal or external. In some versions, she's punished. In others, she simply ceases attacking. Either way, the source of harm must be addressed, not just the symptoms. And crucially, you need to develop what Snow White lacks: the ability to recognize harm despite attractive disguise, the capacity to stay with warnings even when tempted, the self-protection that doesn't require external enforcement. This is developing what psychologists call healthy boundaries and self-regulation, the internal capacity to protect yourself even when something appealing is offered. Here's what fairy tale analysis ultimately reveals. Snow White endures across centuries not because it's entertaining, but because it captures genuine psychological pattern that humans continue experiencing. The details might change. The poison apple might be toxic relationship, addictive substance, self-destructive behavior, harmful career. But the pattern remains, accepting harm disguised as something desirable despite warnings, experience, and knowledge. Understanding this pattern through fairy tale framework provides distance that makes it easier to recognize in yourself. You can see Snow White's vulnerability clearly because it's in story. That clarity can transfer to seeing your own parallel vulnerability. The story also offers hope. Snow White does awaken. Self-sabotage patterns aren't permanent, but awakening requires disruption, requires addressing source of poison, requires developing protection that the story shows Snow White initially lacked. If you recognize Snow White's pattern in your life, if you're accepting poison disguised as care, pleasure, or beauty, if you're repeating harmful patterns despite knowing better, if you're in deep sleep of going through motions without truly living, understand that you're not uniquely broken. You're experiencing documented psychological pattern that's so common it was encoded in fairy tales. But understanding the pattern is first step toward interrupting it. You can identify your specific disguises, recognize your vulnerability points, develop genuine self-protection, and eventually awaken fully rather than living in suspended state. In the next video, I'm going to reveal what other fairy tales reveal about psychological patterns, which stories capture specific types of self-sabotage, developmental challenges, or growth patterns, and how understanding these can illuminate your own psychological dynamics. Until then, examine honestly, what are your poison apples? What makes them attractive enough that you override warnings? What would awakening from this pattern require? The answers are in recognizing the pattern clearly, which is what fairy tales help us do. Subscribe if you want psychology that uses literature and story to illuminate patterns you might not recognize directly, that provides frameworks from depth psychology and fairy tale analysis, and that supports understanding self-sabotage so you can interrupt it before accepting the next beautiful but poison apple.